Hello, welcome to a new episode of Overmorrow's Library, a podcast series for the Center of Contemporary Arts in Geneva. Today, for the last episode of this season, we have the immense pleasure of being with an artist whose music has often accompanied me while I was writing the scripts for this podcast, and also when I was writing my books. We are joined today by Nicolas Jaar to discuss the limits and the metaphysical horizons of music. Nico, thank you for coming on our podcast.
Thank you, Federico. As I think you know, I'm a huge fan of this podcast. I've listened to at least one of them twice, which says a lot because I don't know who listens to podcasts twice. But the one on Simone Weil I had to listen to twice, I think, or maybe another one. I don't remember. So thank you for having me. This is a great pleasure of mine as well.
But let me start asking you, well, first of all, where you are and what you're doing at the moment, because I know that you are in Palestine and you are studying and researching in particular.
So about a year and a half ago, in August of 2020, I went on a long walk. I left my house. I used to be living in Torino. I no longer live there. I left my house and I walked to the river, which was next to the house where I was living. And I decided to just start walking and walking and walking. And after 7 days, I arrived to France and then kept on walking and walked through forests and forests and forests and mountains, and then arrived a month later to Marseille. During these 8-hour, 9-hour, walks through the forests, I had a very strange feeling that was very random to me, but is no longer random because of many reasons. But I had a feeling like I had to start learning certain ancient languages. I wanted to understand some of these metaphysical texts, like the New Testament, the Old Testament. I wanted to understand some Greek philosophy, and all of it in its kind of original text. I wanted to be able to understand what specific words meant. How were they connected to other words? How were they connected to thoughts of the time and whatever. And at the same time, all throughout 2000 and at the end of 2020 and 2021, I started doing a lot of educational work, I guess, workshops, things like this. And it became really the center of what I do every day, what I think about every day. I think I'm trying to think through how to create spaces where where alongside a group of people, we can all learn. How to create classrooms without a teacher, how to create spaces of learning. And so those kind of two things got combined into one geographical destination, which is I was invited to do a long workshop with people that had never made music before in Palestine, in Bethlehem. And so I came here to do those workshops. And at the same time, I'm also studying some ancient languages in Jerusalem.
I know that part of your studies, but also of your research, has to do, well, you were saying classes without teachers, and also, to a certain extent, letters without sounds and instruments without music. There's this kind of relationship between music and silence in what you're studying and what you're thinking about at the moment. Can you tell me more?
Earlier this year, during the summer, when I had a break actually from school, I was in Chile. I was living in Chile for about 4 months. And I met these two archaeologists or ethnomusicologists or anthropologists. I'm not sure what they would call themselves, but I met these two men. One of them is called José Pérez de Arce, and the other one is called Claudio Mercado. And they started very generously sharing some of their knowledge about instruments from a particular part of what is now called Chile, right kind of north of Santiago and around the Aconcagua River. These are instruments from an indigenous culture called the Aconcagua people, and they sent me some texts, and I was very curious to understand a little bit more about these instruments and the kind of philosophies behind it. And I stumbled upon two texts that actually each of them wrote, where they are focusing on the Antara flute. And this is actually what started everything. The entire kind of research that I'm doing now is really started thanks to these two people that kind of opened this world of knowledge for me in Chile when I was there in the summer of this year. When I was speaking with Claudio, he spoke to me about a boy that was buried with his flute. And he was buried with the flute stuck to his mouth. And the flute happens to have been purposefully punctured, broken in the perfect way so as that it cannot emit any sounds anymore. And he told me that this kind of instrument is called instrumento matado, killed instrument. And this just blew me away. The idea that the instrument could be killed, that the instrument could be punctured, and that it would no longer be able to emit sound kind of really moved me. And so I started trying to look into the antara, the flute itself, and why had it been punctured. And so the antara surandina is the kind of flute that is made sometimes out of wood, sometimes out of stone. And you can find it in between Bolivia and Chile, in the central part of Chile, and specifically in Chile near the Aconcagua River. The Aconcagua River is just north of Santiago, and near that river there's the Aconcagua Mountain, which is actually the highest mountain in all of America, in the entire American continent. The antara flute, and this is, I'm quoting José Pérez de Arce, it was actually played by a man that was called El Sacrificador, the sacrificer. And he would play this flute during the sacrificial rituals that involved decapitation. And Pérez de Arce says that in a lot of the representations of these rituals, the antara flute is shown as substituting the head of the decapitated person. And he says it's as if the flute is really playing itself. It is the flute that now becomes the head, but it is also, the flute is kind of taking the space of life, and it is the sound of life itself that you hear in this very particular sound that these flutes have. This actually reminded me of one of those old stories where a Zen master asks his pupil, where he says, "What is that sound of one hand clapping?" Right? And this idea that, does the one hand play itself? What is the hand clapping with? But I was asking myself, if the flute plays itself, who's blowing? What air? There's a few things that are interesting about this flute. Is that this particular sound that the flute makes is called sonido rajado, which means kind of like torn sound or scratched sound. And you can get this specific sound with wood if you want. And potentially it was made with wood also. But because it's about the kind of harmonics that you get, the particular kind of scratched sound that you get. It's not about necessarily the texture of the instrument itself. But the antara was made from a particular stone, from a particular mountain. And this makes José Pérez de Arce really think that these flutes were meant to last through time. They were meant to last through generations, right? They were meant to convey kind of a sense of cultural importance, right? That maybe a wooden flute didn't. And so this, again, makes you ask yourself, why would this flute be punctured specifically, right? If it's meant to carry on through generations. And so, these materials, of course, are, they're meaningful, potentially carrying symbolic content or magical content. And so I started asking myself, well, where did this, where did the stones for this flute come from, right? And of course, there's incredible people who have done all this research before, which blows my mind, because this is not really my area of study. So when I see the level of detail that people go, it's just mind blowing. And so this particular flute comes, like a lot of others of antaras of this kind, from a stone called Combarbalita, which comes from Las Canteras de la Cordillera de Combarbalá, which is the quarries of the mountain of Combarbalá. And Combarbalá is said to derive from the Quechua word Kumparpayay, which means to break with a hammer. So this references, the stonework that has been done in this area for, thousands of years. Now, there is a syncretic feast, like a, Christian and kind of indigenous mix feast that happens in this city, and it comes from the fact from the story where a woman was prohibited to get married with a man that she loved, and she turned to stone. And so the feast has as a symbolic center this natural stone that is kind of triangular in shape, like maybe a woman wearing a dress, and that people assign to as the Virgin Mary. And so there's this entire kind of around this stone that is venerated, flowers and things that kind of point towards the stone as a kind of representation of the Virgin Mary. That's a little example just to say, stories always carry stories with them, which carry stories with them. And even the stone, right, carries, within itself, a kind of interesting kind of symbolic world, even to this day. So in 2005, it was found the corpse of this boy near San Felipe, which is near the Aconcagua River. And he was actually buried with two other people, but he was facing down while the others were facing up. And the other thing, of course, that distinguishes this boy from the others is that he was buried with this flute, this particular flute made from this particular stone, right? From this, with this flute, the santara, next to his mouth. And so the idea here is that the flute was laid to rest, right? Like its owner. In a sense, because the owner and the flute had such a relationship, presumably, this flute can no longer be played by anyone else, ever again. And so, in a sense, the puncturing of the flute makes the flute eternally his, eternally the boy's, right? So there's a relationship between the puncturing, the creating of the void inside of the flute, and this idea of infinity. And I started asking myself this question of, well, where else do we see the idea of void and infinity kind of having this relationship? And well, because of also where I'm studying, I've been looking into Isaac Luria, a 16th century rabbi and Jewish mystic, who kind of proposes a way to understand the contradiction of infinity. So what's the contradiction of infinity for him is that how can there be infinite space and also finite matter? As a philosopher, Federico, I'm sure, this is maybe one of the questions, big questions, right? And so what Luria proposes is that infinity, which is called Ein Sof, no end, no limit, creates a void, and within this void, we exist with our limited existence and our non-infinite understanding of space and time, etc. We exist within the void, right, within infinity. So infinity itself is punctured, and this void is life as we know it. So existence itself is surrounded by infinity, but exists as a kind of void within it. So then I started thinking about this idea of a void being fertile. What does it mean that infinity is punctured by a void, and that this void is the one that then creates life as we know it? This is a question that moved me deeply. And I started thinking about ritual objects, particularly. What are other objects that have been willfully punctured, willfully broken, willfully left kind of emptied in order to bring the object closer to eternity, closer to divinity? And, one of the first, this is less about eternity, less about divinity, but definitely in regards to understanding, kind of as a process. I started thinking about Wittgenstein's ladder. At some point in his propositions, Wittgenstein says, "My propositions serve as elucidations in the following way. Anyone who understands me eventually recognizes them as nonsensical. He must, so to speak, throw away the ladder after he has climbed up to it." So again, there's this idea that there's the creation of a ladder, in order to get somewhere. And once you've climbed this ladder, it's actually, you must do away with the ladder, right? So the ladder is both a way from one place to another, and yet it must be withdrawn, right? So I started thinking about this as a process itself, a process of thinking. Another object, right? So not a ladder this time, that I started thinking about is the tetragrammaton, which is word in Hebrew for God, which is unspeakable, unpronounceable. There is a distinction that was made at one point between what is to be read in Jewish liturgy and what is written, and that not always what is written actually can be read out loud. One of the most kind of obvious examples of this division between Kere and Ketiv, what is written and what is to be said, is the word for God. And so when the word for God is read, you have to either say Adonai, which means my Lord, or Hashem sometimes, which means the name, but you cannot say what the actual letters are saying. Now, the actual letters are also not vowelized, right? There's not the nikud, which is the dots that explain to you whether you're going to, say ha or he or he, right? The vowels are not given to you. Actually, all of the scrolls of the Tanakh, actually, the real scrolls, the ones that used in liturgy, cannot have the nikud. Only the study Tanakh can have the nikud, the dots, right? And so I started thinking about this idea of the unpronounceability of the word for God. What does it mean to leave as unpronounceable the most divine of words, the most divine of concepts? A very interesting anecdote is that there's these translations of the Old Testament called the Septuagint, which is the translations from the original, biblical Hebrew into ancient Greek. Now, the difference between biblical Hebrew and ancient Greek, there's a very crucial difference, which is ancient Greek has a very clear vowel system, alpha, whatever, and biblical Hebrew, like Aramaic, like Arabic, does not. There's a lot of vowels that are not part of the written text, and this is why the nikud exists, the dots that explain which vowels you're supposed to pronounce. And so the scribes, when they had this task of transcribing and translating the original Hebrew Bible into Greek, came to a kind of issue with the word for God. And there's one particular scribe and one particular papyrus, which I think it's called the Papyrus Fuad, and then there's a number which I forgot. I'm sorry, I don't have my notes here. But it's the Fuad Papyrus. And this scribe did something just very, very touching, which I think has something to do with the flute, has something to do with this idea of the fertile void. He decided to leave all the names, of the fragments that we see, all the names for God completely empty. He left empty spaces. Well, he or she, I don't know if the scribe was a woman or a man. And what you can see in the papyrus is that clearly the first scribe left these empty spaces, and someone else with a different pen went in and wrote the original name of Adonai with the Hebrew in the empty space. But you can see there's empty space left and to the left and to the right of the name, of the sacred name. And so this metaphysical doubt that you can see in this manuscript is something that really, really kind of blew my mind, and I felt like, again, there was this void there. There was the questioning of the void.
Is this something that entered also one of your recent works, this compilation of silences that you've released a little while ago? Was it the same kind of research?
I think it's all connected for sure. Somehow the Caves compilation, the compilation of silences, predates all of this by a year and a half or so. But I think it does have a lot to do with it. The Caves compilation in a sense, it tries to maybe answer a similar question to what I'm trying to answer now with this research, which is how can a sonic object have a kind of void within it, or kind of a withdrawn quality within it, which then, in a sense, creates sonic relationships outside of itself?
And the answer is, how can it do it?
I have no idea, but one of the trials, or one of the examples, or no, not examples, one of the experiments in order to try to answer this question of how can something be withdrawn in sound, right, and yet create sonic relationships or relations outside of itself. I think one of the potential experiments to get to an answer, or to never get to an answer, one of the ladders for this answer is the idea of this compilation, which is a compilation where I asked a bunch of friends of mine and musicians to make pieces of music that prepare the listener for a moment of silence of their choosing. And so, for example, my friend Will, I think, made a 15-minute silence piece. So he made this short 2-minute song, which is an introduction to silence. Then the piece has 15 minutes of silence, and then it ends with with a 2-minute little piece that signals the end of silence. And so the compilation is filled with pieces like this, where there is sound, but within the sound there is a kind of, I would say, a fertile void. It can be used as a timer for cooking. It can be used for, if you like to sit in quiet and close your eyes and just have a moment of silence for yourself. You can say, well, I want 20 minutes of silence. Okay, you press play on the 20-minute, cave, and then you have 1 minute that prepares you for it, and then you have your 20 minutes of silence.
When thinking about this fertile void, the first thing that comes to mind is also the role of rests in music, and thinking about rhythmic music, beats, fundamentally. The quality of the beat fundamentally is in the space between the beats, in the tender interval, as Nabokov used to call it. But then at the same time, when looking at rhythmic music today, which is very different from, the shamanic use of drums among the Sami people of Finland or in ancient Siberia, for example, rhythmic music is usually, at the moment, confined either within entertainment, so commercialized fun, or as a aid to the shopping experience, which is I think the greatest use of music at the moment. So I was wondering if you think that whether it's still possible for also including rhythmic music, it's my way of defining kind of like beat-based music fundamentally, to still perform today a similar function of a cognitive enhancer, an expander of the mind, an aid to prayer, however you want to call it, that it used to have in other civilizations and other societies?
It's a very difficult question. Of course, I think whether music plays that role or not is something that one might feel with their own hearts and in very particular moments. And I think any music, even music made for potentially a commercial use, played at the right moment in the right context, might have a very intense, create a very intense experience. That being said, I deeply believe in dancing. I believe in the power of dancing. I feel dancing is something that to really let go of your body and to dance, that feels to me very healing and very, very special and just really necessary. I mean, now more than ever, we are in a moment where we cannot dance together. We cannot, do a lot of things together, and so I think it's making us, rethink, what does this mean? How important is this in our lives? I've heard more than ever before people saying, I miss dancing. I miss being with people, in these particular ways. And so I think dancing itself and music that allows for kind of freeing our bodies in that sense and being together, and dancing communally. I think that is always going to be a kind of expander of some sort.
A personal question from somebody, myself, who is not let's say, whose social life is mostly within the confines of my own home. Do they still exist, places where dancing is done like this? I mean, what comes to mind is back in the days, rave parties, for example. Do they still exist? Is everything now commercialized? Is there still a movement of kind of like dancing that is not just entertainment, once again? Work hard, play hard type thing.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think so. I think there's always incredible people all over the world who are I think keeping that spirit alive for sure. I also think there's a lot to be said about being with 3 or 4 friends and playing a record and just being in your own home if you don't want to leave and dancing with them. Dancing doesn't have to be something where you have to pay a ticket and go to a place and then, wait for 5 hours for this or for that. Or, it doesn't have to be within a commercial festival or a commercial venue. Dancing is something that, after this conversation, both you and I could absolutely do if we were so willing. Right now in our homes, we could also dance alone, or just you could dance with your kid. I could dance with, I don't know who I could dance with right now, but we could, dancing is not something that needs so much.
And getting to my last question, as you know, we are creating here imaginary library for the day after tomorrow. So for the preparing oneself to the end of worlds and the beginning of worlds. And we also have a small discotheque next to the bibliothèque. And I would like to ask you to please contribute with a piece of music or an album, whether it's danceable or not. Then that was the other question, that would feature in our library.
It is a great honor to be able to put a little something in this discotheque or in this library. I think there's not a single album that has influenced me more for the past 4 years of my life than the album called Crescent by John Coltrane. It's from 1964. It features Coltrane on tenor saxophone, incredible McCoy Tyner on piano, Jimmy Garrison on double bass, and Elvin Jones. Wow. Just reading those names and seeing, okay, this is who did this. Just being reminded of that. I would like to kind of contribute Crescent to the library for one particular reason. There's a mixing choice in this album, which is just really, it's really particular. The mixing engineer, who I think is, Rudy Van Gelder, maybe Bob Thiel did it. I'm not sure who made these choices. When you're making a record, the birds outside are making it with you, so it's not just one person. But someone decided to place in the final mix Coltrane's saxophone fully on the left ear, completely. And the room tone on the right ear. And if you're wearing headphones and you were to take out, this is actually how I realized it, because at some point I had to take off one headphone while walking in the street, and I realized, hey, I can only hear the saxophone in the room on the right ear, but on the left ear, I can hear it perfectly. So what does this do? I cannot stop thinking about it. And I think it might have something to do with this kind of transitional time that we're living in. Because by placing the naked sound of the saxophone on one ear and the room on the other ear, or the kind of periphery of the room on the other ear, your mind really becomes the room. In the architecture of your ears and mind, you have really, on one side, the saxophone solo, and on the other side, you have kind of the back of the room. And so your entire mind becomes the room of the recording space. And when thinking about the mind, right, I enjoy this idea of the mind is the room. The room is the mind. And particularly in regards to, I think, some of the topics that you have been speaking about in the first season of the podcast, in regards to world building, in regards to reality building. This very simple mixing choice turns the space between your ears into this kind of room. Not only the architectural room of the recording space in New Jersey, but this kind of metaphysical room where Coltrane is leading us into this kind of searching. And in regards to, world building, I find that this movement towards the room of the mind, right, as a creative space and a space that has the potential for reality making, I think is very interesting and very fertile. In the sense, the mind is also a kind of fertile void. If you enjoy the album, you might enjoy it for 1,000 reasons that have nothing to do with the mixing choices. It's not necessarily the most important thing about this record. It's a very touching record, and I hope our listeners can go listen to it. One of the things that I love about the record is you can hear Coltrane's humility in this piece of music. You hear the musician, as the person that arrives at the end of a long workday and helps you get back home, both spatially and mentally. And I really enjoy that kind of essential humility of music, which is something that just brings you back somewhere, brings you back home.
Thank you, Nico. That's a wonderful way to close this episode and also to close the second season of our podcast. So thank you very much again for being with us today. And thank you also to our listeners for having been with us so far. And hopefully, who knows, maybe we'll meet again, maybe next year, for another season of Overmore's Library, still here from the Center of Contemporary Arts in Geneva. See you next time. Bye.